That was really inspiring and very rich. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and so I'm happy to hand over to Matthew.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Silvia. I mean, I have a bunch of different questions. Maybe I'll just say a few words about how to do this in the chat. If you want to ask a question, just raise your electronic hand and I will try and find people in order. I've got a bunch of different questions. I think this really touches on so many themes of the reading group that we've been doing over the last year or so. I also am quite aware there are over 30 people on this call, which is really testifies to the kind of interest and importance of this topic. But let's start with Andreas first.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. I enjoyed it a lot. I have to confess, unfortunately, I was having internet connection problems, which is a bit ironic on a talk on attention. And one of the things that I want to ask you a bit more was on the relation between the self and the attention. Because being rooted myself a bit in the Greek culture, you have this idea that the right is the middle between two extremes. So on the one side, yes, there can be too much of the self. On the other side, also, well, there can be too less of the self. And particularly if you link it to the phenomena of attention as the loving gaze, many people often then might be able to apply this to others, but not to themselves, and kind of pay too much attention and maybe a danger of losing the self. So it seems to me that that there needs to be a bit of a distinction made in kind of what the role of the self is in relation to attention. Yes, it can be a motor of bias, it can be a motor of your desires that distorts reality, but there might also be something to be said of a proper direction of attention, not only to other objects, but to the self. So just was wondering what your view on this is. You made some short remarks on this. I'm just curious to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you put your finger on, I think, what is one of the main difficulties in talking about attention in Murdoch and Simone Weil. And I think Murdoch herself sometimes goes into different directions on this, because sometimes she stresses the totality of attention and being completely captured by the object. And the idea that any direction of attention to the self is going to be problematic. Because as soon as we cannot even really call it attention if that's the case, because as soon as we direct our focus, let's say, towards ourselves, then we are already in the grip of our own desires, our own fantasies. But what she says elsewhere is that it's actually very difficult to see the self rightly. And that's a very different statement. So if it's just extremely difficult to see ourselves correctly, but it's possible, then attention to the self is not a contradiction in terms, and it is possible. And in fact, her very view of attention seems to both require and deny attention to the self. Because on the one hand, if we don't pay any attention to ourselves, how do we know that when we think we're being so selfless and attending, we're actually being selfless and attending, and we're not just projecting our fantasies? So it seems that some kind of self-knowledge is required in order to attend. So we can say, well, okay, so you might need to attend to the self. It's extremely difficult, but it's not impossible, and you may have to try. But attention to the self and attention to the other can never coexist, because even if you're switching attention back and forth between self and other, or even if you're allowing any kind of attention to the self to interfere, to not necessarily interfere, but to play a role into your understanding of the other, then you're going to be in trouble. Now, Murdoch has a very negative idea of our natural tendencies. She thinks that if we're left to our own devices, we're just going to be selfish, completely self-absorbed, full of fantasies. So she thinks that it's actually a very difficult, long training to do that. So this is based on what is a pessimistic conception of the human mind. And that attention doesn't come naturally to us. That this is what she thinks. So there is another way of thinking about the self in attention, which is, I think, in the end, what Murdoch is really proposing, which is that we only need to remove self-concern. And this is how I prefer to put it, because that allows for some attention to the self, as long as it's not self-concerned. And it allows for attention to reality shaped by the self in positive ways. Because on Murdoch's conception of the self, our imagination is what shapes reality in good ways. So we are able to understand the world through imagination. And imagination is something that we have learned and that we have developed also based on our own experience, based on our personal qualities. But the qualities of the self that can shape attention are qualities such as love, such as compassion, justice, realism. And none of these qualities are self-concerned. And so we can make a distinction between qualities of the self that are self-concerned and those that are not self-concerned. And the latter category is something that we can take into attention. And so attention will become an exercise of the subject, a personal exercise. Weil does not allow for that, but I think Murdoch would be more sympathetic to what you're suggesting with some qualifications.
Great, thanks, very helpful.
Thank you very much. So can we go to Andre now next?
Well, I don't think I am next, so I'll give my please.
I can only see your hand. Who else has got a hand? I can't see anything else. I think you are next, maybe.
All right. Well, thanks for your presentation. It's very interesting. Being an explorer of esoteric traditions myself, I find this talk very interesting. My question would be, well, you mentioned, for example, Weil that goes into this radical idea of abandoning the self and let's say melding or merging with God, right? And then you have the Zazen that say that actually there is an illusion of the self, right? The self doesn't really exist. Now the question is, even if one argues that there's an illusion of the self and we have to integrate with God, right, and to abandon all the self, it is for the self to realize this. So in a sense, the self both exists and it doesn't exist, or exists until it realizes that it doesn't exist, right? So the question would be, what's your thought on actually the idea that this, you often mention the object that we need to put it into attention, but the question is whether there is actually an object and a subject, and whether they are actually the same thing. And when the self or the subject realizes this, actually it realizes that it's the same thing with reality itself, right? That'll be it.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I am sympathetic to the view that you expressed at the end of your question. Now, Weil's thought is explicitly and unashamedly paradoxical. So there is obviously a sense in which if we're going to attend in order to remove ourselves, then who is doing that? Well, we're doing that. So for her metaphysics, we have, well, necessarily we have a perspective, we have a point of view, we have a body, we are placed in time, but we mistake it for a metaphysical centrality and a metaphysical individuality. So this is the kind of self that she is talking about, and she's talking about removing. Now, the main activity of the self for Weil is the will. Whenever we exercise the will, we are accepting the selfhood which is stolen from God, and therefore we are increasing the rift in the tissue of reality created by God, and therefore working against realism and the metaphysical goal, if you like, of the love of the universe. So if we are able to remove our will, then we will come a lot closer to the radical unselfing that she is working towards. And that's why she's very careful to say, when we are attending, it's not at all this kind of muscular effort, furrowing the brows, really, really trying to get something out of it. She calls it a passive activity. Of course, it's something that we do, but it's an effort to give up any will, any activity. So it's the effort to give up all efforts, if you like. She calls it waiting sometimes as well. And she talks a lot about this sense of emptiness, which we initiate, but the real difficulty is to stop trying to achieve anything in attention. And again, I think this comes closer to some thoughts in Zen Buddhism. You're not trying to achieve something. The moment you're trying to achieve something, even if that something is a correct understanding of reality, then you're getting it wrong. So how do we get that to the idea that you and the other are one? Well, in a sense, for Weil, that's exactly right, because giving up the will, which means for her giving up the main expression of her subjectivity of herself, is allowing yourself to be penetrated by the object. But at that point, as you say rightly, the object is no longer the object. The object is just the same as you. But it does start with a sense of division, which is then to be overcome. And that's also why I think Weil comes closer, even though she doesn't identify with a Zen Buddhism, where there is an idea of non-duality. We're not concerned with me seeing you, we're concerned with the experience that we're sharing. But Zen doesn't have the metaphysical, the ontology that Weil does. That Weil is closer to Hinduism, because she thinks that what we do restore in attention is a self with a capital S, if you like, a sort of Atman. And so there is more of commitment to an ontological reality, where the small self becomes absorbed in the bigger self, if you like.
Yes, maybe we can just, that's great, but maybe we can move on to the next question so everyone has a chance to talk. Thank you.
I'll try to answer more briefly.
No, not at all. Not at all. This is just a big group. So next, could we go to Madeline?
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. I've been a big fan of Weil for a while, but Murdoch I haven't read, so this was a great introduction. I just off these last two questions, I was wondering maybe what conception or what sort of dynamic of self and attention you think is most convincing from your own practice and from your own experience, and maybe there is some practice involved in that. And so that's my first question. The second one was moving more to technology, which is to ask, maybe we could explore also, what is the difference between a pop-up you won and a bird also surprising you on the window? I'd be interested to hear a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I've become progressively less convinced by Murdoch's solution, because it seems to be a halfway solution to the problem of the self. It's more linear. It's more comfortable for a Western philosophical perspective, I think, to what we're used to thinking about. But it seems to me that it doesn't quite do justice to the radical experience of that attention can bring about, where even if you theoretically or philosophically subscribe to some kind of conception of a substantial self, what full, intense, radical attention seems to allow you to experience is something different. And that's why I've been traveling from Murdoch to Weil, so the opposite path that you're taking. And I think yours is better, because reading Weil through Murdoch can have problems. I've been traveling towards Weil, who presents, as I was saying, a much more difficult to swallow, much more paradoxical vision of the self. But on the other hand, she is ruthlessly honest. And if she says, well, in attention, we've experienced the disappearance of the self, that's what she means. She's not meaning in metaphorically, she really means the disappearance of the self. But again, if you have Weil's metaphysics, then it makes sense. If you don't have it, then it's much more difficult to accept. And that's why I then moved in my own thinking personally towards the Zen Buddhism, which, I have to confess, for, again, a Western philosophical mind is hard. And I've been working with a Zen teacher for a couple of years, and I still feel that there is something there that I can understand sometime, someday, but it's still out of my reach. But again, philosophically, I like the idea that of non-duality. And I think, again, as I was saying, when it comes to attention, it's perhaps the best way to make sense of all these tensions that we have between the self-shaping attention, the self-disappearing in attention, without needing to have a rich metaphysics. It's just that the question falls away the moment that you are actually engaged in the experience of attention. But that happened to me like twice in the last 2 years. About the pop-up and the bird, well, I would actually like to know what people in the group think. What's your intuitions about the distinction between attention being caught? Because of course we have a distinction between paying attention to something willfully and attention being caught by something. What I'm trying to suggest that attention can be caught by something in different ways, but I would like to know what your intuitions are on this.
Yeah, so that's a question to the group, which gives the moderator some challenges with working out who's going to speak when there are 27 people on the call. One way to do that is to jump in myself and just to say something. So I was really struck, before we go to Rob, that is, I was really struck by something you said earlier about this horizontal axis of attention and the vertical axis, this distinction. And you do some work on digital well-being, and I wondered whether within that debate, it's always about the horizontal axis. It's always a question of what we're looking at, what sort of effect it will have on well-being. Whereas the vertical axis is relatively unexplored. There is some work done in communication science on digital detoxes and just taking, the online out of the equation. But then you mentioned reverie with William James as well. I thought that maybe some of that terminology might capture what the phenomenology is of being online, surfing the internet. We used to call it, not really now, when one is on TikTok, just sort of scrolling, swiping mindlessly. There is a kind of a reverie, a sort of intoxication, a compulsion. There's maybe we don't quite have the words for it yet, but yeah, I thought that might be something that relates to it. But maybe we've got a new hand. Rob has got a question and he's been waiting for some time, but we should try and respond to the speaker. So Bram, did you have something on this point?
Yeah, I had something on the bird versus the pop-up. What I found interesting is, like on your last slide, you said motivation for attention. That should not be seeking, but the eros. Maybe that's the difference. That the pop-up is really made specifically for what you seek. And if people maybe seek for money or they seek for, I don't know, it's like tailored for pushing on that what people seek. And that's maybe that wins over eros if it just happens in a moment. Maybe that's the difference between the two.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe Madeleine also wanted to say something about this since you asked.
Yeah, I think my intuition lies with the last comment where attention is not, as I understand it, is not something we do in a unidirectional way, but it's something that's intersubjective. It's not something I'm just doing one direction. It's shaped by the environment and what I'm attending to. So it's this mutual, I would say, mutual attunement. So maybe part of the difference is that with a pop-up window, the pop-up is built through this huge infrastructure with the intention. And I think that it's like, I'm thinking like infrastructure and intentionality, and the infrastructure's intention is to grasp my attention for data collection and for ultimately for profit. And I'm thinking like, what's that kind of co-shaping in comparison with the bird? What's that mutual attunement and dynamic? And that seems like a quality of difference there.
Right. Yeah, I agree with both. I think that's along the lines of what I was thinking when I come up with this example. Now, the bird comes from Iris Murdoch's very famous passage about the kestrel, which I didn't want to quote because otherwise I'd be sick physically because everybody's quoting it all the time. But it's a good passage because she's talking about brooding about her hurt pride, and then all of a sudden the kestrel is out of her window, and she's snatched out of that brooding towards something outside of herself. So her focus here is on the idea that an external object of attention that takes us away from ourselves is doing something good for us, because it's reminding us that the world is bigger, more interesting than our own hurt pride. But there is another aspect I think that you both pointed at, which is very important, is that attention on this view has to be for nothing. The pop-up is not for nothing. The bird is for nothing. It has a reality of its own, which is valuable for its own sake, not for anybody's interest, either yours or that of those who want to sell you something. And I think that's actually the central element.
Yes, wonderful. Now we've got a couple more questions. I'm not sure if they're on this point or whether they're just on something else. So we've got Tom, and we've also got Matilda, and then we've got Rob's question. So Tom and Matilda, are your points on this point, or do you want to move on? No, Matilda? No. Okay. So we're back to Rob. So yeah, over to you, Rob.
Thank you. Thank you, Silvia, for this wonderful talk. And I must say, I've read your book over the last couple of months, and I really enjoyed it. So thank you. I have two questions, and for time's sake, please choose whichever you find most interesting. One is in a sense, a follow-up to your response to Madeleine's initial question. And I was wondering, so if we look at experiences of attention phenomenologically, whether it's always most accurate to say that in attending to an object, the self is in some sense absent. So I'm thinking of experiences like wonder, and perhaps even more saliently experience, where I can be both kind of captivated by the object in front of me, and at the same time have the thought, well, I'm so grateful to be witness to this specific object. So I was wondering how these kinds of experiences, if I'm describing them correctly, fit into this understanding of attention. That was the first question. The second is much more. I can ask with much shorter time. So in your definition, the notion of engagement is very important. And I think that this, that seems very true in the case of attention. But then also, there's also a lot of stress on detachment in the talk and in the authors you're discussing. And in my own work on attention, I'm always kind of struggling how should we conceive the relation between the two notions? And I was just very curious to know how you think of this. Thank you.
Oh, it's hard to choose. But I'll go with the first. Maybe later, if there's time, we can talk about the other as well. So yes, very, very good example, wonder. The sense of the world as something as wonderful, and the gratitude for being able to experience this. Now, I think there are two things that can be said. One is whether there is a switching of attention back and forth between the wonder that you're experiencing and then going back to the sense of your life, which is not by no means a bad thing, but it's an interruption of the attention to the object, back towards the self and then towards the object. Or, which I think is actually perhaps a more interesting way of thinking about it, I'd like to connect it with a sense of something like being at home in the world. We had a seminar here yesterday on this topic. And one thing that we were talking about is that the feeling of being at home in the world, which is not exactly the same as wonder, but it's connected, I think, doesn't really have to do with me being in the world. It has to do with the sense that me and the world are not really two separate things. And so you can bring back yourself, but in such a deep connection with what you're experiencing that it doesn't really register quite so much as self in those meaningful way. And maybe wonder can be something like this.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, well, let's move to Tom now, and then we'll go to Matilda.
Yeah, hi. For me too, thanks for your great talk. I've been a Zen student for like some 30 years. I recognize a lot in what you said. And this being said, and even though I appreciate everything you've been saying, I'm also struggling with this idea of the loss of self as being necessarily good, and as being always on the right side of things that need to be done. One instance, for instance, I could lose my complete self-image and sense of self by scrolling all the time. That there is a way in which this is also a loss of self, and I'm assuming this is not supposed. We don't think of that as a great event. Rather, something that is to be deplored. And so I'm wondering, even though as a practitioner, I greatly value those moments of loss of self, and I think of them as very important. I'm struggling here, and this is like an open question, whether how important is it actually, and how central is it actually? Because it seems to me that this loss of self is always needs to be framed within, again, an ethical frame. What is the self lost for? And to speak in terms of the Zen tradition, as some of you may know, in the Second World War, the Zen traditions have been deplorably horrible in abusing this non-self to have the monks do atrocities and just shoot and kill, and just because there's no problem, there's no self, so shoot everybody dead, don't worry about what happens to you, there's no self anyway. And they did that, and these are not just abstract dangers, that this really happened. So I'm wondering whether how well it works, what's the reality of this non-self being so central. It seems to me to be something that is, again, framed within an ethical framework. I'm sorry, this is a very vague remark, but it's on my mind.
No, it's not at all. It's a very good challenge. So I would try to think about what's the difference between the loss of self that we may experience in not looking at art or meditating, and the loss of self that we may experience when we're scrolling, and whether they're the same thing. Now, one thing that Murdoch might say is that the scrolling is something that is driven by the low part of the soul, or our own by base desire, the need for gratification, the need for being engaged, the need for being distracted from something. So there can be a way of thinking about it in which the self is present, just not as a conscious object. And we can think of the self as being present as the background, that was a filter through which we experience reality, and as an object. And while it may not be present in the second sense, it may be present in the first. And that is, again, I think, something we need to distinguish between seeing ourselves as individual objects, which could be a way of preventing the kind of masochism that could follow from an ethics of unselfing if we take it in a certain way. Because self-absorption and self-concern is one way of taking the self as an object. Realizing and being aware that we are also individual living beings with a physical body, which has needs, which need to be preserved as much as everybody else, is in a sense taking an outsider's perspective on yourself and preserving your own life in the same way that you would preserve the life of anybody else. And I think that's different from the unselfing that you can have in attention, where the loss of the self is the loss of a self that interferes with your perception, that interferes with your vision. So it comes from within instead of coming from outside. That's a tentative way in which I would answer, but I think it's a very good challenge.
Thank you very much for that response. So let's go now to Matilda.
Thank you. Thank you, Silvia. Hi. It's always nice to hear you giving talks. So my question is more a reaction to the concept of reverie. So I would like to go back to that a little bit, because I think I might just have a warped conception of reverie since I've been reading some stuff coming from psychoanalysis, for example, and there reverie is a way of paying attention. So that's why I was completely blown by reading that in your book, especially. And that's, I think it's something very interesting, because it's a way not to daydream, but to be in the same state of dreaming, but awake. And for a psychoanalysis perspective, dreams are true. Like they point at something that is true about the unconscious, or however we want to call it. So having that state while awake actually allows you to see something that is true. And that's why sometimes psychoanalysts seem they're not paying attention to what the patients are saying, but they're actually in this kind of state. And yeah, so that's puzzling. So I thought that could be one way we could restore proper attention, maybe also restoring good daydreaming, like as in this kind of state. And then just a little reaction also to the bird pop-up. Still on this line of thought, if I'm attuned to a bigger reality, or I'm in this state of being where I'm attuned to something else, I don't see this huge difference between the bird and the pop-up. As in, I can see the bird as telling me, okay, there is something bigger, and I'm just here in my room doing something else. So maybe I can also experience some sort of epiphany there, or however I want to take it. But I can, my attention can be attracted by the bird, and I can see something bigger. But also from the pop-up, like the pop-up comes up and I'm like, oh my God, there's this word where people just want me to buy things all the time, and what am I doing about it? So I don't know, that's also, yeah, that's my reaction to just a part of it. I have more, but I'll just decide it now.
Thanks a lot. So I think you're right about the pop-up. It doesn't necessarily prevent proper attention. Typically, it does because of the way that it's intended, and because of the way in which we tend to take it as something that can offer us something. But that's why I was suggesting that with the attention economy, we don't necessarily need to change not just the object, but also the quality or the kind of attention. Because in principle, it is possible to pay proper ethical attention to anything at all, including a pop-up. You can say, oh, interesting. So this is the work of creative people who have an interest in how human mind works. And they, look, they're trying to make me click on this. How interesting. You can have a detached approach to the pop-up. It's possible. It's not likely, but it is possible. So we can in this way to anything at all. The problem is that we usually don't, and that's to do with the way in which these objects are designed. But I think you're right. It's possible. It's just less likely. And then, you know, if you really push me, I will say that the bird is inherently more valuable than the pop-up. But that's a question for, if you like, moral reality. On psychoanalysis, thank you. Maybe I'll ask you to send me some of this literature that you've been reading on reverie, because that's that can be helpful. I'm taking it mostly from James and Murdoch, and James contrasts attention with reverie, and I think James has a narrower concept of attention than Murdoch. He tends to take it as a focus, a mental focus. Now, what's interesting is that Weil gives us a yet different way to think about something like reverie, because she talks about prayer as paying attention, meaning that you're not thinking about anything, you're being empty. Now that's not reverie because you're not being filled by this proliferation of thoughts, but you're also not directing your attention to anything in particular. And in this state, it's very likely that something will emerge, that you will not manage to be empty in the way that Weil recommends all the time. And that's, I think, where we end up in something like meditation, where you can have a different kind of mental relationship with the things that emerge. So one thing is to be attached to these thoughts, and another is to watch them and see what you can learn from them. And if the latter is reverie, I think this ethics of attention has no problem with it.
Thank you very much. Let's move now to Arthur.
Yes, thank you for your beautiful lecture and also the really nice questions that really helped me understanding. For me, I really want to go into the distinction between focus and attention, which I really liked. And I was thinking about how this related to I think it sounded to me like you make a separation between practice and theory, which is interesting in the sense that for me, Zen Buddhism is also always a practice. And yes, you can try to comprehend or understand it and try to uncover some assumptions that are religious or metaphysical. But there's also always a distinction between, the experience and the way you try to conceptualize it. And I was actually kind of wondering that for example, when you analyze the example of the bird versus the pop-up, there are different possible perspectives. It can either be a self-loss or an ego kind of business. So there are lots of options to focus your theoretical, to take a theoretical focus. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the possibility to apply the distinction between focus and attention to the activity, the philosophical activity of comprehension as well. I very often see that in philosophy, we tend to focus when we try to theorize about something, but would it also be possible to conceptualize in a more attentive way? Maybe it's a bit of a vague question, but it was just maybe you have any ideas on, taking your approach to the comprehension level as well.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree with your stress on the practice. And that's why I think I was trying to point in the direction of this reversal of the method of understanding attention, instead of starting with, okay, so what's attention? How do we realize it? Understanding what's the self, what's the metaphysics? You start with the attention, you start with the experience and the practice, and then you can go back to your philosophy room and have a different understanding of it. And that's something that, again, Zen helps very much with sort of detaching ourselves from the overly abstract conceptions. And Murdoch is very well aware of this, although I don't know if she practices it enough. She's very well aware of the way in which our pictures of the world, including our metaphysical picture of the world, is going to determine the way in which we approach it and live it and see it and conceptualize it. I mean, Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals is the title of the book, and that's precisely this idea that whatever metaphysical picture we have is going to determine how we live. And so it's very important that we are able to go back and forth between these two dimensions. What's the other about? Comprehension? Yes. I think as a philosophical method, this would probably leave us without jobs, but it's exactly what Weil is recommending. Give your attention to the problem. Don't try to solve it. Don't try to do anything. Just stay with the problem until it becomes clear. And the clarity of it can be just an intuition that you wouldn't even be able to articulate. Well, maybe, I mean, we can look for some kind of middle ground between the traditional approach and this one by advocating some sort of empty attention with whatever it is that we're trying to figure out before we then go on and try to write about it. I mean, people say that philosophy takes time, and I think it's very true, but I think it's always underestimated how much time it takes. And again, Weil stresses waiting and patience, which we don't have enough of a lot of the time for good reasons, for structural reasons. But I think that would be a good way forward for her line of work. Thanks.
Okay, let's move to Junta now.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew, and also Silvia. Thank you for the presentation, and also thank you for the book. I really love to read the book. For me personally, my personal practice, what I liked a lot is the tension you described between the attention of joining and letting be. So that's something I struggle with in my practice, and it's nice to have to see it back in the theory as well. I have two questions or remarks. The first one is on normativity. So I like so you really put the focus on the role of attention for ethics, which for me has promises for normativity. Also, if we as philosophers go to people working on the attention economy, that we say there is something that you should do, and we don't have the proof, of course, but we have like good reasons. And so and I like in the first chapter of your book, you refer to this horizontal axis, where there is the good thing, the beauty, other people, the objects in the world, presence, responsibility, all these things that seem to be inherently linked with ethics and attention. So the question for me then is, can we go as far as saying, okay, this is practical, this is an instrument, a toolbox, a strong argument to go to engineers who design this attention economy and say, you should do it differently. So it's a normative call there. That's the first thing. And another thing is, I like to think in systems. In both Weil and Murdoch, it's a lot one-to-one relation. So I am attending to you, and then the story stops. And a system thinker, I like Luhmann with his double contingency. So he says, okay, so social systems, cultures build themselves by this loop. So I pay attention to you as a human being, not a bird. Maybe we can talk about animal agency, but if you talk about two people, so the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law example, it's one person attending to another and another attending to the first one. And so it creates a loop. And system thinkers say this creates a system. And so attention for me is something that not only is between two people, but it's also an element, a characteristic of a system. And so you can link it also to an AI system, because it's part of. So if people communicate with cell phones and their attention is grabbed, it's also a system that emerges with the people and the AI system. So these are two questions, one on the normativity issue and one on the systems issue.
Thank you. So let me see if I understood your point correctly. So first of all, about the normativity. Yes, I think we have good reason to think that every time that attention is being directed, employed, not employed, we have a moral question that arises every single time. Sometimes it will be more obvious and clearer what kind of practical consequences it has, and sometimes not so. But I think it's one of the merits of Murdoch's work that draws attention or focus back to how much each individual act of attention can actually be worth morally. But how do we take this to those who design technology, given that, while we may have a normative story to tell, they may just have different goals, which are themselves not normatively aligned to our own. And I think the difficulty there is not that they don't know what they're doing, is that they know what they're doing. It's just that they're trying to achieve something that we don't agree with. But this is set from a perspective of not having spent a lot of time thinking about these problems, but it seems like a broader problem than knowing how to structure attention mechanisms, which has to do with the broader normativity of society and of the way in which we are allowed to use attention and other people's attention in certain ways. The system question, I mean, I think you're right. I simply have not focused explicitly on either the collective or the system aspect of attention. And that's partly because that would be another book, partly because Murdoch and Weil don't do it, and I was mostly looking at them. And partly because it's absolutely true that these attention systems get created and that there is a collective shaping of attention. We need to look at the political shaping of attention, at the social shaping, at the historical and cultural. All of these things will determine our attention in very significant and fundamental ways. But there comes a point in which there needs to be some individual agency to change that. And I think that's the sort of crux of the morality of attention, this individual effort or this individual redirection of our own attention, which can then ripple out into the direction of others' attention or the nudging of others' attention. But even in those cases, I think that there is a very important individual element which we cannot do without. But that's not the whole story. I agree with that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Could we go to Erin now? We've got 5 minutes left, so maybe we can structure the question and response with that in mind.
Hi, Silvia. Thank you for a fantastic talk. I learned a lot from that. I wonder if you could say a bit more about the link between attention and the aesthetic, because I guess that's my context thinking about attention, is whether it's romantic philosophy and something like Wordsworth's wise passiveness, or Kierkegaard's aesthetic characters and their thing like the crop rotation essay in Either Or, that teaches us how to avoid boredom by sort of switching up our mode of attention. And you mentioned here the attending to art as sort of part of the practice of attention in, I think it was in Murdoch, or maybe in both philosophers. And I'm wondering, and the Kantian background of aesthetic theory there, I'm wondering if the aesthetic is a training ground for attention, that it's meant to be sort of training us for some sort of higher moral purpose in our attention, or if it's an example of attention properly conceived, or kind of what exactly, how to think about the link between the aesthetic and attention.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, that's an exegetical debate in Murdoch studies in particular, whether the aesthetic is training or is a case of attention. And it is both. But so Murdoch in particular, partly for accidental reasons, I think. She was a novelist, she was interested in art, but also for more substantial reason, stresses the importance of beauty and the importance of art. Weil does that too, but in a different way. Weil talks about attending to the beauty of the world, which is not necessarily art. It can be a cockroach. That would be the beauty of the world. But both Murdoch and Weil think of beautiful as the visible manifestation of the good. And so it's aesthetic in this ethical sense as well. But for them, the fact that it's something that you can see it as beautiful is important, because they take it to be something which is more accessible, and therefore it's easier for us to engage with in our training towards attention. And when it comes especially to art, but also let's say to natural beauty, there is an element of, as I was saying earlier, inaccessibility of it. Our desires are drawn towards it, but we cannot consume it. It's not made for us to, well, it's clearly not true for us of the natural world right now, but let's talk about art. It's something that draws our desires, but it's there, it's what it is. And Weil is explicit on the fact that what's important is precisely that we want it to be the way it is. So if we have any desire towards art, it's the desire for it to exist. It's the desire for it to be what it is. And that negates any distortion that comes from our own desires and fears and so on. So again, we have this paradoxical desire. We have a desire, but we have the desire for it to be what it is. We have the desire for it not to change, not to be consumed. So it's a very good training for morality and the case of morality. But I think Murdoch is right in reminding us that if we spend all day just looking at the beauty of paintings and do nothing else with our lives, we will not make a wonderful contribution to the world. And I think part of the task of attention, when it's not directed to a specific object, although we can learn it that way, is for us to take a step back and take a broader kind of attention to, say, the political situation and understand what it is that needs our presence the most. That can also be a task for attention, but it will be a more, what's the word? A more diffuse kind of attention, not a focused kind of attention. So it's a case of attention. It is also training for attention, but I think we need to be careful not to remain in the art gallery only.
Thanks.
Well, that's a beautiful place to end it. Well, thank you so much, Silvia. I would also like to say on behalf of all the people that had to leave, we had some incredible positive comments in the chat about how much people enjoyed the lecture that you gave and the discussion afterwards. So I'd just like to leave the final minute to Gunther, who's just going to say something about the next event.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. And also, I really liked the session. So thank you very much. I just wanted to take the last minute to make some publicity for Soray Hongladarom, who was present today as well, and he will do the next talk on Towards an Ethics of Attention on December the 14th. So you will all be very welcome, of course. And we will send all the people who are on our list of the entire session. We will send the recordings of this session as well. So if you want to re-listen something, then you can do so. I don't know, Silvia, if you want to say something, some final words from your part.
Yeah, I would like to thank you all for the wonderful questions. They were all really spot on and really instructive. So thank you very much.
Okay, great. With that, thanks for coming and hope to see you next time.